Probably not. That's probably overthinking it, but it's an interesting call out.
Hey, you never know. You can never overthink too much with a Soprano. Well, maybe we can, but it's fun anyway.
It's still fun, yeah. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Serialized. I'm your host, Kino. And if you listened to the last episode and you know what we're doing, I'm joined by Stephanie from Sopranos Blueprint, and we're going to be discussing the next season of the show, Season 2. So if you haven't already listened to Episode 1, where we talked about Season 1, go listen to that. But we're going to continue on our discussion. How are you doing today, Stephanie?
Doing well. Can't complain. What about yourself?
I'm doing well, too. And I'm excited for this episode because I felt like last episode, listening back to it, I was very critical of Season 1. Like, if you didn't know me, you might think that I didn't like the show based on all my criticisms. But Season 2 is where I really start to get into the show. This is my favorite season of the show overall. Yeah, I really dig this season. I think it's got that kind of lightheartedness of the early seasons, but also a lot of the kind of strong characterization that we'll see in the later seasons. So it's kind of like the perfect mix for me.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And then, of course, we get these introductions of these very strong characters like Janice, Richie Priel, and I know we'll get into all of that. But
yeah, some of the best characters in the entire show are introduced in this season, and they really take off. Jumping in just straight away into episode 1, Guy walks into a psychiatrist's office. Title setup is the setup of a classic joke that these guys are always talking about. But we pick up in this episode after the end of the last episode. A lot of stuff has happened in that finale. Melfi had to leave her practice because they were scared that they were going to go after her. Tony was about to get into a war with Uncle Junior before he got arrested, and now Junior's in jail awaiting trial. So we start off with a lot of like a carryover from the last season.
Yeah, I think that was really interesting and really great how they started off with the really cool montage. It was a very good year. I thought that was, and I think they knew, especially like after season 1, they're like, it's a hard act to follow because it was so, so new and so groundbreaking in terms of the level of depth of the material for television. And so I'm just, I'm always so impressed when I think about how they not only kept to that level, but actually exceeded it and got even better.
Yeah, and it's definitely a change, too, because they filmed season 1 in isolation, where they filmed the entire season before anything had been released, which was unusual for television at that time. And no one knew who they were, what they were doing. But starting in season 2, the world had, seen the first season already, so they were, massive stars now. There was a lot of attention on the show. I mean, I'm sure a lot of pressure to deliver, but they knocked it out of the park with this season. And Guy walks into a psychiatrist's office, is the first introduction of Janice, who is going to be, well, she's introduced in this episode, right?
He's like, your sister's here, and he thinks he's like, Barbara? No, Janice. And then she's like, I'm going to be 5,000 grand lighter when she's rain dancing back to the commune.
Yeah, we had learned some stuff about Janice last season. We saw her in Down Neck, the flashback. Carmela mentions that both of his sisters had moved away, and Tony was the only one who kind of stuck around. And this is also the introduction of Barbara as well. Barbara's not going to be a huge character in the show. We're going to see her a few times over the years, but they both kind of come back. The Soprano family was kind of reunited for a brief moment here, which is nice. But then, Janice, the real Janice, kind of comes out, and we see that she's here for a reason. She's trying to make some money.
Right, and it's interesting because we finally see the three of them together, and I know Barbara's this sort of outlier, and the sibling that got away, and so I think it's just it's interesting that we really don't learn too much about her, but I feel like the fact that she left kind of says a lot about her by itself.
Yeah, she's the youngest Soprano sibling, and usually it's the youngest ones who are kind of stuck there at home. It's usually the older siblings who leave, and obviously Janice is the one who left, but Tony is kind of the middle child, is the one who really stuck around, which is interesting. But we also have a lot with Melfi in this episode. Her having to leave her practice. She's practicing out of a hotel room with some of her patients, one of whum is Terrence Winter, who started writing this season. He plays one of the patients.
Yeah. I knew they looked familiar. He's the one. He was like we could do it at your house, like, if you want. And she said, that's not convenient for me.
He's in the hotel room with her. All of the writers had cameos, including Robin Green and Mitch Burgess. It's in later seasons. I had to look up which they were, but Matt Weiner, of course, had a cameo
Yeah,
in
I
season
remember.
5.
Yeah, with the news. Yeah,
Yeah, so they all had their little cameos, which I thought was cute.
yeah, that is really cool.
Yeah, but Melfi, she's angry with Tony after all the stuff that happened. Rightfully so.
He made her go on the land.
Exactly, and she does not want to go back to treating him, even though he kind of wants to go back, and we'll see that kind of play out over the next few episodes. But
yeah, I think it's interesting how this episode is one where he has another panic attack that he had sort of not getting over completely, but seemed to be getting a little better at it. And then it's like
they definitely decrease in frequency over the course of the show. At one time I counted like how often they happened, and I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but definitely as the seasons go on, he has less panic attacks. Now, he does continue to have panic attacks even into the later seasons, but they tend to be at very critical moments rather than like this one. He's just driving and he has one. So she does help technically with the panic attacks, but they still stick around from time to time.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to say something else about panic attacks, but then I realized I digress into other seasons, so I'll table.
We'll save those definitely. But yeah, moving into episode 2, Do Not Resuscitate. This is a little bit of a strange episode for some. We have kind of a weird sequence at the end with Janice and Livia having this kind of weird daydream, which we don't usually do daydreams with the characters. We do them occasionally, but it's just kind of an odd moment that stands out here.
Yeah, because it's it's like a contrast also from like during the episode where they have like their little bonding moment over the music. That's also something to me that just like sticks out, because it's like almost for a second you think like there may be some possibility that they could have some sort of semblance of a happy relationship, but then yeah, it was like just a mirage almost.
It was a nice moment, yeah, when Janice brings the music and Livia is almost honestly accepting her as her daughter again, but very quickly Janice ruins it by being Janice and pushing for a DNR. And
Jay also AJ rats again. AJ with his big mouth.
Yeah, it's he does that twice. So I mean, last season he spilled the beans about the therapy, which kind of sets off Tony being hit. But now he does the same thing with Janice here. So yeah, AJ is definitely a snitch.
Even if he doesn't realize it.
You know what's funny? We talked last episode about how Meadow was Tony's guardian angel. You can almost look at AJ in these early seasons as the opposite. He's endangering Tony's life. That's an interesting contrast I'd never thought about before.
Yeah, that is really interesting in terms of, yeah, wow, that's definitely. And it's funny, Tony makes a comment about that like in season 5 where he's talking about like the kids, and he's like, it's like watching an angel fall.
Oh, that's true too. Yeah, who was he saying that in?
So I think he was saying it about Meadow because I know that they were concerned about AJ's. He was having all those school issues, but I could have sworn, if I'm remembering correctly, he started talking about Meadow too, because he was like, oh no, or no, now I'm thinking it may have been AJ, because Murray was like AJ. She was always a smart one, but he was always the first.
Yeah, I remember Carmela said something about that.
He was always good at sharing, so maybe I'll have to rewatch that. But it's about one of them. I feel like the angel fall thing was definitely sticks out.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing for both of them. In this episode, we also have some more. I think this is the first appearance of Bobby Bacala, or maybe it was last episode.
Yeah, no, I think it was this episode.
Yeah. So that's obviously he's going to be a huge character moving forward, and you actually got to speak with him, the actor, and Michael on Talking Sopranos, right?
Yep, that was amazing. And I actually then in 2023, I went to Rhode Island. They were at this little like Italian restaurant, so I'm speaking. And so my husband and I actually went up there in the area, and so I got to meet them in person, which was really, really, really cool. But yeah, they were very both great guys. Yeah, it was interesting when we meet Bobby and he says Bobby Buckley are the last man standing, because he kind of, I guess, not the last man standing technically, that was more like Polly, but in terms of him getting shot while he was standing. I think he might have been like the last person standing that got shot.
Yeah, and it's also, he's one of the few members of Junior's crew. It's honestly a little surprising how small Junior's crew is as starting this season and onward. They obviously they killed, two of his guys last season, Chucky and Mikey Palmise. But starting in this season, he only has old men working for him. He's got that old man Murph, Lupo. He's got another old man too. I don't remember his name, but yeah, definitely we're seeing the Juniors world shrinking starting this season, and that's going to be a constant thing throughout the rest of the seasons.
Absolutely. And I think something that's interesting related to Junior in this episode is I feel like at the end when he's hurt and Tony and Bobby go over there, I feel like Junior thinks that they're about to kill him, that Tony's about to kill him, because when they're like try to pick him up, to bring him to the hospital, he's like, no, just don't let me go to my grave with this guilt. I think he thought that Tony was like gonna whack him in that moment.
There was definitely some paranoia between the two of them that, like, obviously they both did try to kill each other over the course of the show. Yeah,
would have been so crazy.
Yeah, but they, there's also a lot of love there with, Tony lifting him up, and it's a father-son kind of relationship there that Tony didn't really have with his own dad. His relationship with Johnny Boy was not nearly as nice as his relationship with Junior, even though, again, they tried to kill each other. I think Junior was much more of a father to Tony than his actual father was.
Yeah, it shows like how, relationships are complicated and how you can still, there can still be love.
One last note about this episode before we move on to the next one. This is the first introduction of Reverend James Jr., who is the Reverend who's kind of leading the protest at Jack Mazzarone. This is also his first introduction. But he's leading the protest against, the hiring practices of that construction crew. And we learn later in the episode he's actually corrupt. And we'll see him more in some future episodes here. But I want to I just want to highlight him because I want to talk about him when we get to season 4. Because I think there was an opportunity to bring him back in place of Maurice Tiffin for the HUD, but they didn't go that way. But anyway, we'll talk about that in season 4. But this is the first introduction of this guy here.
Yeah, and I think that Reverend James Sr. was also, I really liked the introduction of the two of them, and I like that he he was someone that like Tony literally had nothing on him, so he wasn't afraid of Tony.
And there's also, I think there's a character there that, like, an integrity that Tony really respected about, serving in World War II, all of that stuff. He even wrote, I think in a note here, never underestimate a man's determination to be free.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like that, I think like that was his way of telling Tony, like, that's always been my goal. Like, I'm whatever this you're coming over here to try to do, like, that's not me. I'm just, living like with integrity like I've always been.
Yeah, definitely a very important episode. We got a lot of important introductions here. Not even get into the fact that I think this is also the first time we confirm that Pussy is working for the FBI with his handler, Skip Lipari. So obviously they're setting up a lot of dominoes in this episode that are going to culminate throughout the season.
Yeah, for sure. And one more thing regarding Skip Lipari. I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, that Puss tells Skip that he can't wait to get into his hot tub when he gets home. So it just made me think of how Puss was so adamantly opposed to getting into the tub. He was using the excuse that heat is bad, that he can't use the heat prior season. So.
Well, there's a whole also other thing about, and I need to go back and actually like get the numbers specifically right, but Skip says like, you've been on our tit since like, 95 or something like that. And again, that's the whole kind of, we talked last episode about sort of the timing issues with how long Big Pussy's been an informant. It's kind of unclear. We've got some conflicting information about that, but yeah, basically they're setting up a lot of stuff here.
And Jack Mazzarone too.
But moving into episode 3, Toodle Fucking Ooh, which is one of the funniest titles they've ever put in the show. We get the introduction of Richie Aprile, who is my favorite seasonal character of all time, and not counting Junior, probably my favorite character in the entire show.
He's one of my favorites too. Did you hate when I first, like, literally the first time when I watched the show, it was like, anyone that was Tony's enemy was my enemy in terms of like from a viewer's perspective. But then like the second time I watched, and from then on, I just loved Richie because he's such a he's a big part of what makes season 2 what you and I think is the best season in the series.
Well, I actually loved him from the first time I saw him, and maybe it's because I watched clips before I watched anything else. But I just found him such a funny character, and I thought it was cool how intimidating he could be, despite being a very small guy. Like Tony towers over him, but
He's tremendous moxie for his size.
exactly, and it's true. Like he's able to really project a lot of power, where he's like, he's standing out to Tony, and just like you could tell this is like a guy who will throw down at any time. So I thought it was a really cool performance.
Yeah, he reminds me of Feats, like in that aspect, in the sense of like outrageous, but in a hilarious way. Like where it's like things that you're like, what are you doing? Like this is horrible. But it's also like they have a way of doing it where it still makes you laugh.
I regret that we never, a lot of these characters get, killed or written out of the show, and we never got to see a lot of them interact with each other. Like we never got to see Richie interact with Ralph or Feach
oh my gosh,
Lamanna
talk about a fiery moment.
That would have been crazy, but a lot we're entering into not a formula per se, but we're entering into kind of a similar trope that they're going to do, which is the seasonal villain, which is in this case is Richie. We're going to get Ralphie in future seasons. We're going to get Feach Lamanna, but they have this trope where they introduce an antagonist. We're going to have some conflict with, and then it's eventually going to resolve. And season 2 is the first time we kind of set up that trope.
Right. And in one where like where they're all sort of, they all have this comedic lens, like even with, Ralph, his horrible, things that he did. He's also then had the hilarious, prank calling Nucci, and also a lot of like hilarious lines. One thing from Tudo Fucking You that I literally just discovered today, because I was rewatching Tudo Fucking You, and when she complains about the mess, of course she's pissed that Meadow that made the mess at Olivia's at the party, and she's complaining, and she's like, it's like a shooting gallery in there. And then I thought, I'm like, wait, later on in the season, you make a mess when you actually shoot Richie, and they have to bring other trash bags and clean up your mess. So it made me think of later on in the season.
I never thought about that parallel, but yeah, you're right. They end up doing the exact same thing as having to clean up that house because of what Janice will do at the end of the season. But I always thought the Meadow storyline in this episode with Olivia's house was interesting. She throws a party there. She kind of manipulates her parents into not really punishing her. We see kind of like the devilish side of Meadow, that she can manipulate her parents. Daddy's little girl, exactly. But at the end of the episode, she feels guilty about what Janice said and kind of making problems, and she, without prompting, goes over there to clean the place herself. And Tony's very shocked when he sees it. It's like, this is, so unlike my children to actually take responsibility. And like, what do you make of that moment? Because it's one of the more interesting endings of an episode.
Yeah. So part of me, wonders like whether or not if Meadow, if she hadn't heard Janice bitching about her and sort of, like making personal insulting remarks about her, or things that she would be, insulted by, would she have still done it? Like, was she just doing it so that she would look good, or was she doing it because she actually felt guilty? That's something I think about, just in terms of from the beginning, the episode when she was very sort of, hostile against Tony, like saying, oh, she didn't do anything. And then, of course, when she heard Janice talking about, saying, oh, she's, who does that? That's disgraceful. And so that's something that I think about. But, yeah, I think Tony was certainly surprised when he saw her cleaning.
And I also think, too, that we're seeing the different sides of Meadow. Like, again, Meadow can be very manipulative, and she can get what she wants, and she's not afraid to be, kind of the mafia princess that she is. But we also see that she has this kind of sense of responsibility, this sense of wanting to do the right thing, which we'll see play out later on, especially when she wants to be a lawyer. I think that kind of gets corrupted over time, and we'll definitely talk about that in season 6. But we're seeing the different facets of her character. She's definitely someone who's concerned about, responsibility and the right thing, even though she doesn't always follow through on stuff like that.
Right, yeah, and also in terms of like, also, like unravel what her specific motives are at different times, because of the fact that they change so much. But it's more like sort of like a roller coaster in terms of her. Like, there's no one like straight trajectory.
One last thing I want to say about this episode is just, I thought it was interesting that, we have Beansy Gata, who Richie runs over, and Tony makes a point of forcing Beansy to take money. It's one of the first instances we'll see of Tony's kind of habit of like he doesn't want to feel guilty about any of this stuff, so he kind of forces them to take money, and so he can kind of like not feel guilty about what happened to the guy, even though really he's not responsible in any way for what happened to Beansy. Like, that was all on Richie. Tony didn't like allow it to happen or anything, but I just thought it was interesting to see that kind of behavior, which we'll see Tony trying to buy people off like that over and over again throughout the series.
Oh yeah, and even again later on this season in Bust Out, when he's like, take the money, kick it up to that foundation. And, like, that was like this was like this episode. It was the start of his like trying to get rid of his guilt, and then like that later on was like, okay, here's the rest of the money. Like, now we're good. I'm clean. I've washed my hands clean of this.
But definitely moving on to episode 4, Commendatory, which probably one of the fan favorite episodes, and I really like it too. It's one of those, like, it's so different to see them in a different location like Italy. I mean, it can be kind of a comforting episode too, because there's a lot of nice, shots of them in Italy having a good time here. But there's also some really good storylines happening with this episode. In particular, like Carmela's storyline, which this episode is one of my favorite Carmela episodes in the show.
Oh yeah, I love how they're having the lunch, and then Angie, when she brings up Puss, and then she talks about how when he came home finally, she heard him at the door and she wanted to vomit. And then later on in the episode, the same thing. Tony's walking in the door, and then Carmela hears, "I'm home." And then you could like see just that she's almost feels that sort of way. And that it's interesting also seeing both her and Janice sort of like try to justify and make decisions about things, because they kind of go against each other, where they're both wrong in certain areas, but then they're also both right in certain areas. So it's interesting seeing them kind of, go back and forth in the kitchen too.
It's funny seeing Janice basically having this real like kind of feminist point of view, while Carmela points out that she's dating Richie Aprile, who is this, as much as Janice makes fun of the, macho Italian guys, like Richie's absolutely like that. And Janice has her own kind of justifications, but it's all bullshit. But
oh yeah, Richie from the plight in prison understand. It's like, okay, you keep telling yourself that.
But I really loved in this episode, Carmela, how she like pushed Angie not to divorce Pussy because she can't deal with her own.
What's her excuse?
Yeah, it's exactly like she doesn't like. She wants to not have to think about divorcing Tony, so she pushes Angie to stay with him, which I thought was a very. It makes her such a complicated character. I really love it.
Because it was very like manipulative, but it's also I feel like it was driven by not Carmela, not like. Because she just wanted to like manipulate Angie and like because she loved Puss so much, but I think it was more like she was scared and hurt, and it was something she was always worried about, like losing Tony. So I think she just wanted like someone to almost like be able to bond or connect with over that sort of that hurt.
And for the Italian storyline in this episode, I thought it was very interesting how Tony doesn't pursue Annalisa Zucca, who he's obviously very attracted to. He has a dream about having sex with her, but at the same time, she's this very powerful woman who kind of intimidates him. I think reminds him of other powerful women. He says outright she reminds him of Melfi, but I think she also reminds him of his mother, this kind of very strong maternal figure that he is kind of not sure how to deal with.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like the real, just like how he said to Olivia, if you were born after those feminists, you'd have been the real gangster. That made me think of it when you just mentioned mother character.
Yeah, so it's obviously a very interesting situation he ends up with her. And I also thought the whole exploring how these guys are not really like Italian, even though they talk a big game about their cultural heritage, they really have no connection to their homeland. And that's very clear when Paulie is, bumbling through Italy. It's very, very funny scenes.
Right, it's like a very they have a very like romanticized version of things, but then when they get there, it's and I think certainly the people there are less impressed with them than they are with Italy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like, their view is very crass. They're viewed as like they don't understand the culture at all. And I think some of the characters, when they, return home and they're driving home and you see the looks on their different faces, I think Paulie was sort of ignorant to all of that. He didn't really even think about it, but others like Tony are kind of looking,
right. Like you saw they're contemplating it. Like, yeah, definitely. And I thought it was cool, like the part when where she talked to about how the oracles, and just in terms of like a sort of philosophical, like broad, like general life theme, and just how like kind of things go on and on and on and on, like, even like how there were people before them and then people before them. So just sort of like how we're just a little part of like the overall cycle of life.
Yeah, and I love also in this episode that when Annalisa tells Tony he's his own worst enemy, he comments that like that's kind of dumb because everyone's their worst enemy. But then later on, when he tells Melfi about this, she says the same thing, but he argues against it. He's like, "Well, you had to have been there."
Yeah, which is so funny which is funny because that's like your own worst enemy. It would be something that like you wouldn't have to be there. You know what I mean? Because it was like with a cliche, it's like everyone kind of gets what that is, so you wouldn't have to be there. You just reminded me of that again. I always feel like
I just think it's funny that he at the time thought that was stupid, but later on he sort of like romanticized what she said to him.
Oh, well, when it's convenient for him, also like just like he'll be like he'll say some things ridiculous, and then he'll like with how he repeats to Olivia, like it's like a hotel at Captain Teebs, like
Teebs,
things that he'll hear.
So that's lot of great scenes in that episode. But moving on to Big Girls Don't Cry, which is the first episode written by Terrence Winter, who very quickly rose to the top of the writer's room of The Sopranos. Like, besides David, he was the right-hand man behind the show since his kind of introduction.
Right. And then went on to create Boardwalk Empire.
Another great show, yeah. But this is one of the really, great episodes in terms of having a very strong storyline throughout it. We have Christopher doing this acting for writers course that that Adriana buys for him, and having to deal with emotions that he's not used to dealing with through this acting. He has like a tantrum and basically throws away all his writing because he can't, even though he wants to be an artist, he can't really deal with expressing himself through art, which is what he's trying to do.
Right, because I think he gets to a certain point with like processing his emotions, but then it's almost like then he freezes and then switches back and like realizes he's becoming vulnerable, and then he has to almost like then overcompensate by punching the guy in the face.
I said last episode I thought he did a Tennessee Williams scene in this one, but I was wrong. It was Rebel Without a Cause, and they did another one that I don't remember what it was. I think the gentleman caller.
Oh yeah, that's right. Adriana's like, maybe he's a gentleman because he was like he wants to fuck this broad, and this, like he's assuming that like everything is just very like, oh, this guy automatically wants to sleep with this woman, like the character.
Yeah, I just wondered if that was a Tennessee William play that they were doing. I'd have to look it up off the top of my head, but I wondered if there was a connection to the legend of Tennessee Moltisanti, because again, I was wondering why they picked that specific writer, and I thought in my head that maybe one of the scenes that he refused to do was Tennessee Williams, but I can't remember.
Okay, let's look it up.
I think it was the Glass Menagerie.
Oh yeah, the Glass Menagerie.
It is Tennessee Williams. Okay, that's what it was. Now, yes, okay.
Now that makes sense.
They definitely connected it there, which is pretty cool.
Another thing I thought regarding the acting class, the guy, I think his name was Mitch, and he was the one he sells cars in the acting class. He kind of reminds me almost of like an alternative of Gloria, only because like the car salesman. I mean, obviously he's not that he has this of course personality, but almost like an alternate, like this is a male civilian who, this is sort of, he's doing the same thing Gloria does. Like, it's kind of the car salesman thing made me think of Gloria.
Yeah, I almost wonder if, because in season 3, which we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here, but we do see another guy working at the car dealership who asks Gloria to like, if she can switch days off with him or something so he can go to see his kid or whatever. I almost wonder if those would have been the same people at some point, but probably not. That's probably overthinking it, but it's an interesting call out.
Hey, you never know. You can never overthink too much with The Sopranos. Well, maybe we can, but it's fun anyway.
It's still fun, yeah. This is the first. We get Tony also dealing with the fact that he wants to return to therapy. He, even Melfi is, calling him because she feels guilty about not taking him back. Tony kind of doesn't really want to go back. He's trying to act like he doesn't need therapy. However, he's also calling people like Hesh to talk about his problems because he has this kind of intrinsic need to talk to people, even though he himself doesn't want to listen to their problems. He just wants them to listen to his.
Right, which is something I think that, we find what some of the other, guys have in common as well. But with Tony, it's, very, very, explicit there, especially I love how they were talking back and forth to themselves, basically like telling this like each other's stories while they were like the other was talking.
Not really listening to each other. Yeah, it's very much a common trope in this
season.
And
it was it was funny. Yeah, also then how Tony learned that his father had panic attacks as well in this episode when Hesh tells him.
Yeah, the hereditary angle of the panic attack is very interesting. It's a topic they're going to bring up later with AJ, and even connecting it to other characters like Livia, like how she was depressed and the whole kind of family. It's just like it's this inherited like Sopranos curse that they're all kind of going through. I thought it was a very interesting angle, and it makes the family dynamics very interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's something where, his family, obviously, they never went to therapy. So they just sort of continue to almost like pass down this like generational trauma and like some of these unresolved like mental health issues that were never really dealt with or addressed.
And in the next episode, The Happy Wanderer is also, dealing with that same thing. Tony has that line in the episode where I got the world by the balls, but I can't stop feeling like I'm a fucking loser.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, The Happy Wanderer, is one of my favorite episodes. I love it.
And he even talks about the fact that like he shouldn't hate these happy people.
Yeah, he shouldn't want to smack the Happy Wanderer's face.
Yeah, and he goes back to therapy. In this episode, he acknowledges that he wants to be in therapy for some reason, even though it makes him feel weak to be in there. But again, it's his only place he can really talk about some of these things because, he can't talk with his friends about it. He can't talk with his family. And he just wants to be open for once with just why he wants to go back to Melfi.
Right. Yeah, he needed that outlet again desperately, like we saw from Big Girls Don't Cry. The fact that, Hesh basically was becoming his therapist, even though he didn't necessarily want to be. So yeah, I think it goes to show, even though he was so, reluctant about therapy, it was certainly a noticeable absence once he stopped going and wasn't able to go.
And the big storyline in this episode is about Davey Scatino, a friend of Tony's who gets involved with the executive card game and ends up owing him a bunch of money.
And Richie too.
There's a lot of angles to this storyline. Obviously, one is Tony preying on a friend who, he even admits that that's what he did. It's his nature, the scorpion and the hawk.
But I still feel like I feel like with Davey though, like he was so adamant and like kept pushing to go. I mean, even to the point where he just still showed up anyway. So while Davey, certainly he had this gambling issue that one could exploit and take advantage of once he's in it, I feel like Davey also is somewhat to blame for sort of going after Tony as well. Like
it's definitely Davey's fault. No one made him. In fact, Tony actually did. You're right. Try to tell him like, hey, this game isn't for you. But Tony himself later in Bust Out admits that like in the back of his mind, he's like, well, worst comes to worst, I can take this guy's store. So it's it's his predatory nature to do stuff like this. But definitely it's Davey's fault.
Right. But yeah, I know what you mean in terms of like kind of assessing the situation and seeing what you can then do to like take most advantage of where the situation is. Like how Artie mentions it too later on, just like we had said.
But definitely the interesting angle too of the Davey Scatino storyline is with Meadow. Meadow's friends with his son Eric. Tony tries to give Meadow Eric's car, which Melfi kind of interprets as a way of like
him forcing her to like confront
the realities of their life. But it's interesting at the end of the episode that Meadow and Eric are supposed to do a duet together. Meadow's really interested in this stuff because it helps her kind of get to a better college and get away from her family. And in the end, she gets to perform a solo, which is even better for her. So she benefited from this, even though she, was disgusted by it. I think that's indicative of her relationship to the mafia as she gets older. She's on one level she's disgusted by it, but on another level she gets to benefit from
Right,
it.
exactly. I mean, even just, same thing with Carmela as well. And also I think it was interesting, like, I think that scenario, I think, like, because of how aggressive and nasty how Eric took it out on Meadow, I think that made her almost more take on a more, like, screw you attitude to like, to where by the end of the season, when Carmela talks to her and she's like, my friends don't judge me and fuck them if they do. I think that how Eric acted almost, made her sort of want to be some more supportive of her father because of how much he insulted him and her.
It's definitely a thing where she, like, internally, like with her family, she'll criticize the mafia, but when it's an outsider, she sticks with her family, which is definitely a plot point that will be coming up again in future episodes. Moving on though to D Girl, this is an unpopular episode I saw you written here, but also a very important one for Christopher. Like, this is one of those critical moments for his character of deciding, like, what does he want to do? Does he want to go down the Hollywood route, or does he want to stick and be loyal to Tony? And he has to really struggle with that in this episode.
Definitely. And I think, I know for me personally, I don't like seeing, him cheat on Adriana. So I think that's one thing where I'm like, oh, I could go with that without seeing that part. But yeah, I mean, the fact that, when he sits outside and then decides to go back inside, that wasn't one step he was taking toward following Tony into hell.
That and long-term parking are I think, the two critical moments where he could have left the life and gotten away from it, but instead he chose to double down into it. And I think those were, both not good decisions. But yeah, it's a very important Christopher episode. I will say though, we talked about why this episode isn't liked. I don't know how liked it is in the community, but I know one element that I really did not jive with is the Jon Favreau cameo. Of all the celebrity cameos they've done in this show, this is the one that felt like, I don't know, it didn't work for me. I didn't believe Jon Favreau on this show, and I think it's interesting that very few people ever talk about this cameo as compared to, like,
Ben Kingsley,
or some of the other, Lauren Bacall, or some of the other, like real celebrities they've had on the show. Jon Favreau playing himself never kind of felt right to me.
Yeah, well, and it's kind of like, I guess, a little bit like random when you think about sort of the rest of the show or the episodes in this season, sort of how things are developing, where it's like, Richie and Puss, and then of course, Christopher wanting to move up. So I guess it like, it could, I agree, it could be taken out, like completely removed, as if it was just, they were like doing cut and paste and just like cut it out. And like, I don't think we would be really missing anything in terms of cutting Jon Favreau out of it. I mean.
It's more like Amy is the more important character here for Christopher's development rather than the few awkward kind of scenes he has with John. But the other side of the storyline is with AJ, him going through existentialism, not believing in God, smoking marijuana as confirmation. This is a key episode for AJ of like trying to figure out who he is too. And it's interesting the direction his character goes from here, but I thought it was interesting they gave AJ this kind of teenage angst episode to kind of deal, like, him feeling lost.
Yeah, because there hadn't been much like going too in depth with AJ, and I guess that in some ways made sense because he was a young teenager. But I feel like I feel like one of the better AJ episodes, just in terms of, because a lot of what he says, it's true. Like when he talks about life is absurd. I mean, whatever you want. Maybe it's coming from AJ Soprano. It's still true.
Yeah, I mean, he's dealing with this stuff, and he even talks to Livia, who kind of doubles down on the existentialism. She's like, it's all a big nothing.
How AJ tells Livia that Pussy says that he should come go talk to her because she's old and has wisdom and stuff. I'm like, Puss told him to go talk to Livia for wisdom? The hell is wrong with it?
I know, right? And well, obviously, we should talk about Pussy's storyline this episode because he's struggling with, being an FBI informant. We didn't talk commendatory, he kills some guy who maybe recognizes him. He's paranoid he's going to get found out. He's really struggling. And he has, a scene here where he's, crying because he was talking to AJ about what a great friend his dad was to him. But here he is betraying him. We start to see his kind of psyche, like, fragment move forward. Like he's got two personalities,
right? Well, and how even previously, before they went to to the Soprano home, Puss, basically attacked Angie. And when she was getting ready, when they were trying to get ready for his confirmation, and if their son hadn't like walked in, I mean, he literally said like, "I'll kill you."
It's definitely like we're being reminded that for as sympathetic as Pussy can be and what he's dealing with, he's also, a monster himself. Like, he's done a lot of bad stuff. They all have. So we'll see that more in another episode here. I know I'm being cognizant of our time, so let's move on to Full Leather Jacket. Obviously, the jacket with Richie is like one of the biggest memes of the series, but definitely like I've talked about this in other videos I've done too. But like that jacket really meant something to Richie, as kind of cringy as it was that he was obsessed with this jacket. It really meant something to him and his past accomplishments with Rocco DiMeo, and to see Tony kind of just throw it away like that is one of the things that's going to push him to try to have him killed.
Right. He felt disrespected, just like he did when Tony walked up and left the table immediately. It was like that, but to the times 100 in terms of his offense.
And we also have stuff in this episode with Matt and Sean. We've seen them here and there throughout these episodes. They're underlings basically to Christopher. They're disrespected by the guys like Furio and Tony and stuff like that, and they're tired of being kind of stepped over like this, so they decide they're gonna kill Christopher to try to get respect, which in hindsight is such a stupid plan. It's
crazy because Sean says to Matt, like, "You always do that. You leave me in the cocksucking motherfucking wind," and then that's exactly what Matt does. When he gets shot, Matt leaves Sean dead in the car and runs away.
It's interesting with these two characters, right? Next season, well, technically this season, we're going to get introduced to Jackie Jr., but next season is when
they're like the unfortunate sons. It's like Brendan Filone. That's what I like to think of them in my head. I think of them as like unfortunate sons, like as opposed to the...
It's sad that we don't get as much character. Like Jackie Jr., we get a strong storyline too of why he's the fuck up that he is. These two, we get a little bit of it, but it's like each season they're kind of expanding on this trope. We have Brendan Filone, who's just an idiot in season 1. No real character, if we're being honest. He's just kind of there.
Yeah, like I couldn't really, I always think about that. Like, I don't know if I'd have enough, like, legitimate, like, material. Or no, I would, but I feel like a lot, if there was, like, I were to do a video about Brendan Filone, a lot of it would just be, like, speculation. Because there's not, like, that much actual stuff we see.
And he dies relatively early. He dies 3 episodes in. But now this season, they're kind of expanding a little bit more. We're seeing, like, Matt specifically, feels very undermined, and he takes the action he does. It's still not a fully complete storyline, but at least we're getting some material with these characters here. And then next season, they'll kind of culminate that with Jackie Jr.'s storyline about why he does all the stupid stuff he does. But it's kind of interesting that each season they've been kind of playing around with this idea and expanding on it more and more.
Yeah, definitely. Sort of like these misguided young guys that, for one reason or another feel disrespected and think that they need to make some big move to get recognized, and then it ends up totally backfiring.
Yeah, I mean, even Christopher's storyline occasionally deals with stuff like that, but he's got at least enough on his head to not do some of these stupid things and try to do things the right way. But yeah, the younger generation's dumb and they don't know what they're doing is like a trope that's goes throughout the entire show. And you can even look at some guys like Tony, who in a lot of ways are not living up to the previous generation.
And also the older generation though too, when you think about like Feach and Junior. So I think I just thought of that when you mentioned the younger generation. Like, I guess there's, criticisms of, they both have their strengths and weaknesses.
But moving on here to From Where to Eternity, this is my favorite episode of the show for personal and just because it's a great episode. But
that's really cool that it's your favorite. I love it too. Is there a reason why it's your favorite?
The personal reason was when I did my Soprano log series like many years ago, I was watching each of the episodes, at different days and then recording my thoughts on them. And I recorded this one on my birthday when I had friends over. We were watching it all together. So I have a very kind of personal connection to the episode because it was a very nice night. But beyond just that, it's a very good episode in terms of it's not self-contained. I don't want to say that. There's actually a lot in this episode that plays out. The killing of Matthew Bevilacqua. Like this is an important plot episode, but there's something nice about like it's Christopher in the hospital. He's dealing with his thoughts about going to hell and stuff like that. There's stuff for Carmela to do. It ends with Carmela and Tony, arguing about him getting
the vasectomy, but then she doesn't want him to.
Yeah, so there's a lot of good. It feels a little bit self-contained. It feels like you could just watch this by itself and get a lot of cool. And a lot of my friends who watched it was their first time watching the show, and they were able to kind of understand a lot of these character moments.
Oh
even though they
yeah,
hadn't
even
seen
Polly,
the show.
like you could, if someone's like, oh, like what's this Polly guy all about? Like, why does he have such a what are some like wacky stuff he does? And this would be like a perfect episode for that.
One of my friends pointed out that in this episode, Big Pussy is constantly talking about negative energy.
Oh yeah,
she says that he says that Richie has negative energy, and she just kept laughing that like, why is this mob guy always talking about negative? Like
That's
it's like
so
almost
funny.
like a hippie thing.
That reminds me of like when Christopher says, "In my thoughts, I use the technique of positive visualization," like in terms of on the opposite side.
It's funny how they deal with the kind of modernity that they live in of like these guys, being mobsters, but having like talking about psychology and talking about other kind of modern stuff.
Right, and then even like ancient philosophical, like Sun Tzu.
Yeah. Overall, I mean, great episode. Tony leaving his son to go kill Matthew Bevilacqua, who himself was crying out for his mommy when he died. It's like a lot of good stuff.
And then that leads into the next one into the next episode where we see the little boy yelling, "Mommy, mommy," and the mom.
Yeah, and we'll move on to the next one here, Bust Out, because this one plays off of the events of the last episode. Tony thinks he's gonna get sent to prison for what happened here. Pussy is basically going full on FBI agent, like he's fully given himself over.
And then, I mean, I like how he mentions that he keeps his suitcase in his car.
Yeah. Like, tell us again.
Yeah, he's like, fucking bygones, never bygones.
Yeah. The bust out of Davy's store, I like that we got to explore just how psychologically damaging it is to have these guys in your life, because I think we don't ever really focus on the victim's perspective as much. We focus on the gangsters, but I do really like that we got to see Davy dealing with this. We got great stuff with Carmela and Vic Musto. It's the first time she kissed a guy. I mean, it's quote unquote cheating, not really compared to what Tony does.
Right, but but it's like she actually went for it. Yeah,
and we'll obviously see that progression go on in future seasons, but
yeah, and I love Meadows' "the sometimes we're all hypocrites" quote that comes from this episode. I love that moment.
That scene with the two of them was really great. It was like, he's drunk and he's trying to talk with her and she doesn't really want to, but at the same time, like, they can relate to each other because they are very similar, more so than even like Tony and
when they
AJ.
get each other, like, so you could tell, like, when she giving Tony that little like sly look, like it's she gets him, and they even for all his faults, they are kind of kindred spirits a little bit.
Yeah, this is the one where Tony skips AJ's swim meet, right?
Yeah, yep, and then he and Carmela, they get in a big fight.
It's interesting looking at these two episodes back to back, because the last episode was him yelling at AJ about his weight and
the vasectomy.
Yeah, so it's interesting, these two episodes, he's kind of hard on AJ, like, particular, and he's like kind of favoring Meadow as his favorite child overall.
Yeah, that's true. He really that does sort of emphasize that. I also just think it's funny, like, when Carmela just says, like, AJ, you're like a fish out there. Of course, like, in hindsight, I'm like, it makes me think of like Big Puss, like later on in Funhouse, but that's
well, it's also Tony wanted to go fishing with AJ too, so I don't know what that means necessarily, but there is like kind of a fish motif running through this episode.
Mm-hmm. And then of course Carmela gets stood up, so she's upset about Vic at the end.
Yeah, Carmela's always trying to get some guy, but it never works out until season 5. It always, something goes and she gets pissed off about it. But the next episode, House Arrest, here, another one of my favorites. Like, I think this is the most comforting episode of the entire show.
I love this episode too. Like, when I think of it, I think of them zooming out at the end. But yeah, also even just like them hanging out in Satriali's, or with Junior, like Catherine Romano and Junior. Yeah,
he gets a little kiss at the end. It's very sweet. Like,
yeah, that was really, really. She's one of the, I'd say, like, the most like wholesome like character, like, in terms of just people that we see on the show. Period.
Yeah, there's not a lot of like important stuff that happens this episode. They get, like Tony has this thing about Richie selling cocaine on the drug route.
Oh yeah, another panic attack.
Another panic attack. Junior and Richie are kind of working together. Melfi's dealing with the fact that she is under heavy stress. Like it's interesting that she has to drink to see him.
And I like this episode when she makes the "Do you know why a shark keeps moving?" quote. I like that, and also another like I guess fish reference with the shark. But I think it's like, and I think and he thinks she's talking about Richie, which I mean she could, but I think it's like this. I guess he doesn't realize that she could also be referring to him in terms of the lexophymia.
Definitely like a very comfy, very nice episode, kind of like a calm before the storm.
Yeah, definitely like you could wind down before bed and watch it sort of episode.
But the knight in white satin armor. Now this is, a very critical episode, and I never kind of realized this before until right now, but you're a big Game of Thrones fan, so you know that like there's this trope that Game of Thrones does where it's the second to last episode where a lot of big shit goes down.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, The Sopranos totally does that. The penultimate.
They do that too. Yeah. Last season 2 was the shooting. The assassination was I think it was, or maybe it was a different one.
Which one? Which assassination? Sorry,
Isabella. It's the second to last that's when the shooting happened. So in this one, they do the big confrontation with Richie that's been building up the whole season. It happens in the second to last episode, so you're not quite expecting it. I wonder if Sopranos is the one that kind of invented that formula that Game of Thrones would later use.
Maybe. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised considering, how many with different like directors and producers and people that went on to help make Game of Thrones and other HBO shows. But yeah, specifically with Game of Thrones, I'm thinking of season 1. The penultimate episode with Ned Stark in season 1, how that definitely caught me off guard.
Yeah, or season 3, that's the big thing that we're not going to spoil what happens, but
you all should definitely go watch Game of Thrones if you haven't watched it. Shameless free plug.
I know, for a completely different show, but
other shows they'll talk about.
But it's all HBO, but yeah, Knight in White Satin Armor, really good episode in terms of I love the resolution. That like, okay, they're building up this conflict between Richie and Tony, and Janice is the one who's instigating a lot of it. She's actually encouraging this guy to kill her brother so that she can, make more, because Richie will be an earner and she'll make more money from it. But it culminates with Janice killing Richie because he hit her.
Well, and that's another, I just realized well, I won't spoil it, but I was saying in terms of siblings, not being very fond of each other. Another in terms of Game of Thrones similarity.
Oh, of course, there's a lot of DNA there. We talked about that last time.
But yeah, in terms, I think it's funny how Janice, how she was on sort of the one side, but then ends up basically taking care of things, and how Richie violates his own rule basically, like when saying don't, if you want to raise your hand, sir, you can give her your last name, but whereas then he and Janice weren't married yet.
And, another thing that happens that we just talked about last time is Tony breaks up with Irina, but sends her like $75,000 as like, so he doesn't have to feel guilty about it. Oh,
that was a great Silvio moment. Silvio and Svetlana moment also.
First introduction of Svetlana, who's obviously going to be a big character in future seasons here. But yeah, they're having their own, problems in this episode. But it's a great exit to a character. I think like they did his storyline very well, where it builds up and it climaxes in this. And again, this is the second to last episode, so you're like, well, what's going to happen next episode? They did the central conflict of the season already, and it sets you up perfectly for Funhouse, which is probably one of the most the most shocking episode they've done up until this point.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think this, like, that Funhouse was when I was first watching, and I realized like just how emotionally invested I sort of was in the show, with how emotional I became with the scene on the boat. Because like we were talking about, we know that, Big Pussy, he's not, not a good guy. None of these people are particularly, up for Man of the Year, but it's just, the emotion that they showed with how everything went down, even to little things like Syl, saying he was, getting nauseous, but just because he probably doesn't want to kill his friend, the dream sequences, everything.
Yeah, this is the first real crazy dream sequence that involves Tony. We talked last time about how The first one was Christopher, surprisingly, but dream sequences will become associated with Tony moving forward. And this is the first time we get those elaborate sequences, Tony having to kind of having to acknowledge his subconscious about, Pussy being the rat here, and then that's the first half of the episode. Then the second half of the episode is them actually killing Pussy, which has been building up to for a while, but it's still very shocking. It's like, oh man, one of the core cast is being killed here.
Right. Well, and especially because of how the scene goes down, where it's like we're all kind of just, the characters included, sort of just frozen for a few moments, where you really don't know. And Pussy's like, "Can I sit down?" Like we're all kind of just like waiting to see what happens next, and then boom.
And also, too, they do this kind of trick where they have Tony dreaming about Meadow graduating and like, oh, it's all a happy moment. And then it's revealed that he's just dreaming that while they're on the way to kill Pussy. It's a thing they would do again in long-term parking with Adriana.
And it's such I love the transition in terms of, going from the dream to the waking state and then back and forth. With Free Falling by Tom Petty, I think that made it really, really powerful. The transition with Tom Petty's song.
Yeah, we get like a montage, as we started season 2, we got a montage of what's been happening, and we get another montage here at the end. Tony, telling Christopher that he's going to put him up to become maid, which is going to be a big plot point in season 3. Davey leaving, Meadow going off to college. It's setting up a lot that we're going to continue on to the next season, but I just feel like, man, this season was so strong in terms of like, we got incredible character moments. We got kind of a consistent theme throughout the show. And each of the episodes kind of felt very integral. There was no episode where it was like, it's nothing like a hit is a hit, where you're like, oh, we can just get rid of this one. Each episode felt like, man, they're perfectly leading into the next one. Not necessarily always in terms of plot, but definitely in terms of theme.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and it really, it just kept getting like better and better. And then even, after so much happened in the penultimate episode, the fact that they then still had this, really, really powerful finale, it was just so much talent. I remember I was just completely blown away by the time we got to the end of it.
Yeah, like I said, this season is where I feel like, okay, this is the Sopranos, and we're going to keep up this quality throughout the rest of the show. Any other final thoughts about the season before we head off here?
Nothing too much. Like I said, season 2 is also my favorite. I think, the introduction of Janice and then Richie and all the, other little plots like Baby Scatino, etc. Sort of, it really has that. I can't think of one thing that it doesn't have that. It has, I think, all the qualities that make a show a really great show.
Now, next episode here, we're going to talk about season 3, so definitely stay tuned for that. We got a lot more great stuff coming up. Thank you all for listening to this. There will be links to all of our channel and all of our links and stuff like that in the description of the video or in the show notes, depending on where you're listening to this. But thank you all for joining us, and stay tuned for the next episode coming soon.
Thanks so much.